Family shocked by newborn's first cry. The sound was like nothing human. Who is this baby? To find out, watch to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel to get more stories just like this. The dim glow of the hospital's fluorescent lights reflected off the pale green walls, casting long shadows that danced like specters in the stillness of the room. Jessica Miller lay on the hospital bed, her face a mask of exhaustion and anticipation. Beads of sweat glistened on her forehead as her husband, Daniel, gripped her hand tightly, his knuckles white with tension. Their journey to parenthood had been anything but easy. And now, as Jessica was moments away from delivering their first child, a strange sense of foreboding lingered in the air. The pregnancy had been complicated from the start. At just 10 weeks, Jessica had suffered a severe bout of hyperemesis gravidarum, leaving her bedridden for weeks. Then, during her 20-week anatomy scan, the doctors had spotted something unusual, an anomaly they couldn't quite explain. The baby was developing normally, but there was a faint, rhythmic hum that seemed to emanate from her womb. It wasn't the sound of a heartbeat, nor was it the muffled thump of fetal movement. It was something else entirely. The medical team dismissed it as a mechanical issue with the ultrasound machine, but Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The hum wasn't constant, but every now and then, when she was alone in the quiet of the night, she swore she could hear it, faint but distinct, like a distant chant carried on the wind. Jessica's labor had progressed rapidly, much faster than anyone anticipated. By the time they reached the hospital, she was already 8 centimeters dilated. The doctors and nurses scrambled to prepare for the delivery, their hurried movements a blur of blue scrubs and latex gloves. "You're doing great, Jess," Daniel murmured, his voice trembling despite his attempts to sound reassuring. "Just a little longer, and we'll finally meet our baby." Jessica nodded weakly, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The contractions were relentless, each one more intense than the last. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced, a raw, primal force that seemed to consume her entire being. As the minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity, the room was filled with the sounds of monitors beeping and the occasional murmur of the medical staff. The obstetrician, Dr. Harris, stood at the foot of the bed, his expression a mixture of concentration and concern. "All right, Jessica," he said, his tone calm but firm. "On the next contraction, I need you to push as hard as you can." Jessica nodded again, mustering every ounce of strength she had left. When the contraction hit, she bore down with all her might, her screams echoing through the room like a chorus of agony and determination. And then, finally, it happened. The baby emerged, a tiny writhing bundle of life, slick and red with the fluids of birth. For a moment, there was silence, the kind of silence that stretches and thickens, filling the space with an almost tangible weight. Dr. Harris held the baby up, his face frozen in an expression of shock. The nurses exchanged uneasy glances, their hands hovering uncertainly as if unsure what to do next. Jessica and Daniel, too exhausted to speak, stared at their child with wide, disbelieving eyes. And then the baby cried. The sound was piercing, cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. But it wasn't the cry of a newborn, that thin, high-pitched wail that fills parents with both relief and joy. This was something else, something unnatural. The cry was deep and resonant, almost guttural, like the mournful call of a wild animal. It reverberated through the room, sending shivers down the spines of everyone present. What is that?" Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible over the strange, otherworldly sound. Dr. Harris didn't answer. He was too busy examining the baby, his hands trembling as he cleaned and swaddled the tiny body. The cry continued, rising and falling in a haunting cadence that seemed to defy explanation. Daniel stepped closer, his legs unsteady beneath him. Is the baby okay?" he asked, his voice thick with fear. Dr. Harris finally looked up, his face pale and drawn. "The baby is healthy," he said slowly, his words carefully measured. "But I've never heard a cry like this before. It's not normal." Jessica felt a surge of panic rise in her chest. She reached out for her baby, her maternal instincts overriding her fear. Give me my child, she demanded, her voice trembling but resolute. Reluctantly, Dr. Harris handed the baby to her. The moment the infant was placed in her arms, the strange cry ceased. The baby's eyes, a startling shade of deep amber, locked onto hers, and Jessica felt a jolt of recognition, as if she were staring into the soul of someone she had known for lifetimes. For a moment, all the fear and confusion melted away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of love and protectiveness. But then, as she cradled her child against her chest, she felt a strange vibration, a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to emanate from the baby's tiny body. "Do you feel that?" she asked Daniel, her voice barely above a whisper. He reached out to touch the baby's back, his hand jerking away as if he had been shocked. "What is that?" he asked, his eyes wide with alarm. Before anyone could answer, the monitors in the room began to beep erratically. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. The strange hum grew louder, filling the room with a pulsating energy that seemed to seep into their very bones. Dr. Harris shouted something to the nurses, but his words were drowned out by the escalating noise. Jessica clutched her baby tightly, her heart pounding as she tried to shield her child from the chaos around them. Suddenly, the hum stopped. The light stabilized and the room fell silent once more. What just happened?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. No one had an answer. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the soft rustling of fabric as Jessica adjusted the blanket around the baby. She couldn't take her eyes off her child. Those amber eyes glowed faintly, almost imperceptibly, in the dim light, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her in a way that no newborn ever should. Dr. Harris cleared his throat, stepping back cautiously. "I've seen a lot in my career, but this isn't something I can explain," he admitted, his voice trembling. "I think we need to run some tests." Jessica bristled, tightening her grip on the baby. "Tests? What kind of tests? My baby is fine," she snapped, her voice sharp with maternal instinct. Daniel, though visibly shaken, placed a hand on her shoulder. "Jess, maybe we should. Just to be safe," he said softly, though his voice betrayed his own uncertainty. The nurses exchanged uneasy glances but began preparing to wheel Jessica to the maternity ward. As they moved through the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallways, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on her. The hum, she could still feel it. It wasn't as loud as before, but it was there, faint and persistent, like a second heartbeat she couldn't escape. Once settled into her room, Jessica finally let herself relax a little. Daniel sat in the corner chair, his face pale and drawn, his eyes fixed on the baby in her arms. "Do you think something's wrong?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica looked down at her child. The baby had fallen silent, its tiny chest rising and falling rhythmically. It looked so peaceful now, so normal, but Jessica couldn't forget the sound of that cry, or the way the room had seemed to warp and shift around them. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I won't let anyone treat our baby like some kind of experiment." The words had barely left her mouth when the door swung open, revealing a tall man in a white lab coat. His badge identified him as Dr. Mitchell, a pediatric specialist. His expression was unreadable as he stepped into the room, clipboard in hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller," he began, his tone calm but authoritative. "I've been briefed on your case. I'd like to examine the baby to ensure there are no underlying conditions causing these anomalies." Jessica hesitated, her arms instinctively tightening around her child. "No," she said firmly. "You can look, but you're not taking my baby anywhere." Dr. Mitchell nodded, clearly used to dealing with protective parents. He approached slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. As he leaned in to inspect the baby, the hum grew louder, resonating through the room once more. He froze, his eyes widening in shock. "That sound?" he murmured, stepping back as if burned. "It's coming from the baby." "We know," Daniel said sharply. "What does it mean?" Dr. Mitchell shook his head, clearly rattled. "I've never encountered anything like this before," he admitted, "but I'm not sure this is purely medical. What are you saying? Jessica demanded, her voice rising. Are you telling me my baby isn't human? The doctor hesitated, clearly struggling to find the right words. I'm not saying that, he said carefully, but there are phenomena that science can't explain. I think we may need to involve specialists outside the medical field. Jessica's heart sank. What kind of specialists? She asked, her voice trembling. Before Dr. Mitchell could answer, the baby stirred. Its amber eyes opened, and for a moment, the room seemed to darken, as if a shadow had passed over the sun. The hum intensified, vibrating through the walls and floor, making the medical equipment beep and flicker erratically. Suddenly, the baby let out another cry, the same deep guttural sound that had filled the delivery room. This time, it wasn't just a cry. It was a roar, powerful and primal, shaking the very air around them. The lights flickered wildly, and the glass of water on Jessica's bedside table shattered, spraying shards across the room. Dr. Mitchell stumbled back, his clipboard clattering to the floor. This isn't possible, he stammered, his voice barely audible over the deafening sound. Jessica held her baby close, her own fear eclipsed by an overwhelming need to protect her child. Stop it, she screamed, her voice breaking. You're scaring them. As if in response, the cry ceased abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The baby's eyes met Jessica's, and for a brief moment, she felt a strange sense of calm, as if the child was trying to reassure her. But the calm was short-lived. The door burst open, and a group of hospital security guards entered, followed closely by a stern-looking woman in a black suit. Her presence exuded authority, and the badge clipped to her lapel identified her as a representative of a government agency Jessica had never heard of. I'm Agent Carter, the woman said briskly, her eyes scanning the room. We've been monitoring anomalies like this. You'll need to come with us immediately. Jessica's heart pounded. No, she said firmly, clutching her baby protectively. We're not going anywhere. Agent Carter's expression didn't waver. This isn't a request, Mrs. Miller, she said. Your child is unique. We need to ensure their safety and yours. Daniel stepped in front of Jessica, his fists clenched. You're not taking our baby, he said, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken threats. Jessica's mind raced, her instincts screaming at her to run. But where could they go? And what would happen if the hum returned? Or worse, if the cry did? The baby, oblivious to the chaos around them, let out a soft coo, its amber eyes glimmering faintly in the dim light. Jessica looked down at her child, her resolve hardening. No matter what, she would protect her baby. Leave us alone, she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. We're not going anywhere with you. Agent Carter didn't move, her expression unreadable. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded to the guards. I hoped it wouldn't come to this, she said quietly. Jessica braced herself as the guards stepped forward, her heart pounding like a drum. She wouldn't let them take her baby, not now, not ever. The guards moved closer, their heavy boots echoing ominously in the small room. Jessica clutched the baby tightly, her breath quickening as she pressed herself against the bed's headboard. Daniel stepped in front of her, his arms outstretched as if his sheer determination could hold them back. Stop, he barked, his voice trembling with rage. You can't just take our child. Agent Carter remained calm, her sharp eyes assessing the situation. You need to understand, she said, her tone measured. This isn't just about you. That child, your child, could be dangerous, even unintentionally. Jessica's voice broke through the tension, raw and full of defiance. Dangerous? Are you listening to yourself? This is a baby, not a weapon. The hum began again, low and rhythmic, barely noticeable at first but growing steadily louder. The guards hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. One of them muttered under his breath, gripping his baton tightly. The baby stirred in Jessica's arms, its tiny hand reaching out, and the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. The hum deepened, resonating in their chests like the rumble of distant thunder. Jessica felt it vibrating through her bones, and she saw the fear etched into the faces of everyone around her. "You're scaring them," she said, her voice trembling as she looked at Agent Carter. "Please, just let us go." Agent Carter didn't respond. Her focus was entirely on the child. Her calm demeanor cracked just slightly as the hum reached an almost unbearable intensity, shaking the walls and causing the lights to flicker wildly. A monitor in the corner of the room sparked, the screen fizzling out with a sharp pop. Suddenly, the baby let out another cry. This time, the sound wasn't just a roar, it was a force. The windows shattered, and the guards stumbled back, shielding their faces as glass sprayed across the room. The lights overhead burst, plunging the room into darkness illuminated only by the faint, eerie glow of the baby's amber eyes. Daniel grabbed Jessica's arm. "We need to go. Now!" he shouted over the chaos. Jessica didn't need to be told twice. She clutched the baby to her chest and slid off the bed, her legs trembling but determined to carry her forward. Daniel led the way, pushing past the stunned guards and pulling her into the hallway. The air outside the room felt just as oppressive, heavy with an energy that seemed to radiate from the baby. Behind them, Agent Carter's voice rang out. "Stop them," she commanded, her tone sharp and unyielding. Jessica and Daniel ran, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Alarms blared, their shrill wail competing with the low hum that followed them, like a predator stalking its prey. Hospital staff scattered out of their way, their faces pale with confusion and fear. "Stairs!" Daniel shouted, pointing to a door at the end of the hallway. He threw it open, and they began their descent, the echo of their hurried steps mingling with the distant shouts of the guards. Jessica's arms ached from holding the baby so tightly, but she refused to let go. The hum was growing louder again, vibrating through the walls and floor, making the metal railings tremble beneath their hands. She glanced down at her child, who seemed completely unfazed by the chaos, its glowing eyes fixed on her with an almost serene expression. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, the door burst open behind them, and the guards spilled in, their shouts echoing through the narrow space. Daniel grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and hurled it at their pursuers, the heavy canister clanging loudly as it struck the floor and rolled toward them. "This way!" he yelled, pulling Jessica toward an exit door that led to the hospital's parking lot. The night air was cool and sharp, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat inside. They sprinted across the asphalt, dodging parked cars as the shouts of the guards grew closer. Jessica's chest burned with every breath, but she didn't dare stop. Her baby's safety depended on it. Daniel spotted a parked van with the keys still in the ignition, likely left there by a paramedic in a rush. Without hesitation, he yanked the door open and helped Jessica climb inside. "Drive," she urged, her voice desperate. Daniel didn't need convincing. He started the engine and slammed his foot on the gas, the tires screeching as they sped out of the lot and into the darkened streets. For a moment, the only sound was the hum, still faint but ever present, like a heartbeat that wouldn't stop. Jessica cradled her baby, rocking gently as she whispered soothing words, more for herself than for the child. "What do we do now?" Daniel asked, his voice shaky as he gripped the steering wheel. "They're not going to stop coming after us." Jessica looked down at her child, the faint glow of its eyes illuminating its tiny features. "We keep driving," she said, her voice resolute. "We'll find somewhere safe. Somewhere they can't find us." Daniel nodded, though doubt lingered in his expression. He knew as well as she did that safety was a fleeting concept now. Whatever their child was, it had drawn the attention of powerful people, people who wouldn't rest until they had answers. As they disappeared into the night, the hum softened, fading into a gentle rhythm. For now, at least, they were free. But Jessica knew the peace wouldn't last. She didn't know what her child was, but one thing was certain: their journey was just beginning. And whatever lay ahead, she would protect her baby with every ounce of strength she had. The world had changed the moment her child let out its first cry, and it would never be the same again. The van roared down the empty highway, its headlights slicing through the darkness like a beacon. Jessica held the baby close, her heart pounding as the events of the past hour replayed in her mind. The cry, the hum, the shattered glass. It all felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. but the weight of the child in her arms, warm and steady, reminded her it was all too real. "Do you think they'll track us?" Daniel asked, his voice breaking the tense silence. Jessica glanced at him. He was gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white, his eyes darting nervously between the road and the rearview mirror. "They will," she said quietly, her voice filled with grim certainty. "People like that don't just let things go. But we can't let them take our baby, Daniel. We can't." "I know," he replied, his jaw tightening. "But we need a plan. We can't just keep driving forever." Jessica thought for a moment, her mind racing. "We'll head for the cabin," she said finally. "The one your uncle left you. It's isolated, out in the woods. No one will think to look for us there." Daniel nodded, his grip on the wheel relaxing slightly. "All right, but we'll need supplies. Food, water, anything we can carry. And we need to find a way to stop them from tracking us." Jessica looked down at the baby, who was gazing up at her with those unnervingly intelligent amber eyes. The hum had softened, almost imperceptible now, but she could still feel it. A steady vibration that seemed to connect her to the child in a way she couldn't explain. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The baby cooed softly, reaching up to touch her face with its tiny hand. The warmth of its touch sent a wave of calm through her, and for a moment, she felt as though everything would be okay. But the moment was fleeting, and the weight of their situation pressed down on her once more. "Daniel," she said suddenly, her voice urgent. "Stop at the next gas station. We need to pick up a burner phone and some basic supplies. We can't use anything traceable." He nodded again, his focus on the road ahead. "Got it." They drove in silence for another 20 minutes before spotting a small, dimly lit gas station on the side of the highway. Daniel pulled in and parked near the entrance, leaving the engine running. "I'll go," he said, unbuckling his seatbelt. "Lock the doors and stay here." Jessica nodded, her arms tightening around the baby. "Be quick." Daniel stepped out of the van, glancing around nervously before heading inside. Jessica watched him through the windshield, her stomach twisting with anxiety. The baby stirred in her arms, its soft coos a stark contrast to the tension that filled the air. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Jessica's eyes darted between the gas station and the darkened highway, her paranoia growing with every second. When Daniel finally emerged, carrying a plastic bag, she let out a shaky breath of relief. "No." He climbed back into the driver's seat and handed her the bag. "I got a burner phone, some snacks, and bottled water," he said. "It's not much, but it'll hold us over until we reach the cabin." "Good," Jessica said, her voice steadier than she felt. She set the bag on the floor and cradled the baby closer. "Let's keep moving." As the van pulled back onto the highway, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced out the window, scanning the dark expanse of trees that lined the road. The shadows seemed to shift and move, but she told herself it was just her imagination. The hours stretched on, and the exhaustion began to take its toll. Jessica's eyes grew heavy, and she fought to stay awake, unwilling to let her guard down. But eventually, the rhythmic hum of the baby and the steady drone of the engine lulled her into a restless sleep. She awoke with a start, her heart racing. The van had stopped, and the only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Jessica sat up, clutching the baby tightly. "Daniel?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. He was standing outside the van, his back to her as he stared into the darkness. Something about his posture sent a chill down her spine. She opened the door and stepped out, the cool night air biting at her skin. "Daniel, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. He didn't respond. She moved closer, her unease growing with every step. When she finally reached him, he turned to face her, and her blood ran cold. His eyes were wide with terror, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Jess," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I saw something." "What do you mean?" she asked, her grip on the baby tightening. "In the woods," he said, his voice shaking. "There's something out there. It's been following us." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She turned to look at the dark expanse of trees, her heart pounding. At first, she saw nothing but shadows. But then, in the distance, she saw it. A faint, flickering light, like the glow of fireflies, moving slowly but steadily toward them. The hum began to grow louder, emanating from the baby in her arms. It pulsed in time with the flickering light, as if they were connected. Jessica's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the ground. "Get in the van," she said, her voice firm despite the fear that gripped her. "Now." Daniel didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled back into the van, slamming the doors shut as the light grew closer. Daniel started the engine and floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as they sped away. Jessica held the baby tightly, her heart racing. She didn't know what was out there or why it was following them, but one thing was certain. They weren't just running from the agency anymore. They were running from something far more dangerous. The van hurtled down the dark, winding road, the trees on either side blurring into shadowy streaks. Daniel's hands were steady on the wheel, but his face betrayed the panic coursing through him. Jessica sat rigid in her seat, the baby cradled protectively against her chest. The hum was louder now, pulsing like a warning, and the glow from the baby's eyes illuminated her pale, determined face. "What was it?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with fear. "That light? It wasn't normal." Jessica shook her head, unable to find the words. All she could do was hold the baby tighter, her maternal instincts warring with the creeping terror that threatened to overwhelm her. Behind them, in the distance, the flickering light appeared again. It wasn't stationary. It was following them, weaving through the trees like a predator closing in on its prey. "It's still there!" Daniel shouted, glancing in the rearview mirror. "What the hell does it want?" Jessica turned to look, her heart sinking as she saw the light growing closer. It wasn't just a single point of light anymore. It was a cluster, dozens of glowing orbs floating in a loose formation. They moved with an almost sentient precision, their movements too deliberate to be random. "Faster," she urged, her voice breaking. "Get us out of here." "I'm trying," Daniel snapped, his foot pressing harder on the gas pedal. The van surged forward, its engine groaning in protest. The road ahead twisted and turned, and Daniel struggled to keep control of the vehicle. The van swerved dangerously around a sharp bend, the tires skidding on loose gravel. Jessica braced herself, her grip on the baby tightening as the hum grew even louder, vibrating through her entire body. And then, without warning, the lights disappeared. "Did we lose it?" Daniel asked, his voice a mixture of hope and disbelief. Jessica didn't answer. She scanned the darkness around them, her pulse racing. The hum had softened, but it hadn't stopped, and she knew better than to let her guard down. "I don't think so," she said finally, her voice trembling. "It's still out there. I can feel it." Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles white. "We can't keep running like this, Jess. Sooner or later it's going to catch up to us." "We'll figure something out," she said, though she had no idea what. "Just keep driving." The cabin wasn't far now, another hour at most. It was their only hope, their only chance to find shelter and regroup. Jessica clung to that thought like a lifeline, even as the fear gnawed at her. But the silence was short-lived. The hum grew louder again, vibrating through the van like a warning bell. And then the lights reappeared, closer this time, brighter. They weren't just following the van, they were surrounding it. "Oh my God," Daniel breathed, his voice barely audible. "They're everywhere." Jessica turned to look and felt her stomach drop. The lights were no longer just in the woods. They were above the road, hovering in the air like a swarm of fireflies. They flickered and pulsed in time with the hum, their movements synchronized, deliberate. The baby stirred in her arms, its tiny hands reaching out toward the lights. Jessica felt a surge of panic and tried to pull it closer, but the child seemed drawn to the orbs, its glowing eyes fixed on them with an almost hypnotic intensity. "What do we do?" Daniel asked, his voice breaking. "We can't outrun them." Jessica's mind raced, her instincts screaming at her to protect her child. "Keep driving," she said, her voice steady despite the terror that gripped her. "Don't stop, no matter what." Daniel nodded, his jaw set with determination. He pressed the gas pedal to the floor, the van lurching forward with a burst of speed. The lights followed, their movements growing more erratic, more aggressive. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they attacked. The van rocked violently as one of the orbs slammed into its side, sending a shower of sparks flying. Another orb struck the rear bumper and the vehicle swerved dangerously, the tires screeching as Daniel fought to keep it on the road. "They're trying to stop us," he shouted, his voice filled with panic. Jessica clutched the baby tightly, her heart pounding as the orbs closed in. One of them slammed into the windshield, cracking the glass but not shattering it. The light was blinding, and Daniel shielded his eyes with one hand as he struggled to see the road. "Hold on!" he shouted, swerving the van sharply to avoid another attack. The baby let out a cry, its voice rising above the chaos. It wasn't the guttural roar from before, but a high, piercing wail that seemed to echo in Jessica's mind. The hum grew louder, vibrating through her entire body, and the lights faltered for a moment as if startled. "What's happening?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Jessica said, her voice shaking. "But keep going. Don't stop." The baby's cry grew louder, more intense, and the lights seemed to recoil, their movements becoming less coordinated. One by one, they began to flicker and dim, retreating into the darkness. "It's working," Daniel said, his voice filled with disbelief. "The baby. It's driving them back." Jessica held the child close, her heart pounding. She didn't know how or why, but the baby's cry was affecting the lights, pushing them away like a force field. The hum was deafening now, a constant vibration that filled the van and seemed to resonate with the very air around them. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights were gone. The hum faded, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Daniel slowed the van, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. "What just happened?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Jessica said, her voice trembling. "But we need to keep moving. We're not safe yet." Daniel nodded, his face pale and drawn. He pressed the gas pedal again, the van lurching forward as they sped toward the cabin. Jessica held the baby close, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. What were the lights? Why were they after them? And most importantly, what was her child? The cabin was close now, but Jessica knew their journey was far from over. Whatever was happening, it was only the beginning. And the answers they sought might be more terrifying than anything they could imagine. The van skidded to a stop on the dirt path leading to the cabin, gravel crunching under the tires. The structure loomed ahead, barely visible in the faint moonlight that seeped through the dense canopy of trees. It was an old, weathered building with warped wood and a sloping roof, more of a hunting lodge than a proper home. But to Jessica and Daniel, it felt like a sanctuary, at least for the moment. "We're here," Daniel said, his voice shaking with relief and exhaustion. He killed the engine, plunging them into a thick, almost suffocating silence. Jessica cradled the baby against her chest and stepped out of the van, her legs wobbling beneath her. The cool night air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the distant chirping of crickets was the only sound that broke the stillness. Daniel came around to her side, his hand on her back as they made their way to the cabin. "Let's get inside," he said, glancing nervously at the dark woods surrounding them. "I'll come back for the supplies." Jessica nodded, clutching the baby tightly. The hum had stopped, leaving her body feeling strangely hollow, as if a vital part of her had gone quiet. But the unease in her chest hadn't subsided. The lights were gone, for now, but she knew they weren't safe. The cabin door creaked loudly as Daniel pushed it open, the sound echoing in the empty space inside. He flicked the light switch, and a single bulb in the main room sputtered to life, casting a dim, yellow glow over the dusty furniture and cobwebbed corners. "It's not much, but it'll do," he said, gesturing for Jessica to sit on the worn-out sofa. Jessica eased onto the couch, the springs groaning under her weight. The baby shifted in her arms, its amber eyes flickering faintly in the dim light. She stroked its cheek with trembling fingers, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. "I'll grab the rest of the stuff," Daniel said, heading back to the van. Jessica watched him leave, the door closing softly behind him. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The baby was calm now, its small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. For the first time in what felt like hours, the tension in her body began to ease. But the reprieve was short-lived. A sudden, sharp knock at the door shattered the fragile silence. Jessica froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned toward the door, her breath catching in her throat. It couldn't be Daniel. He had just gone outside. And it wasn't the soft rustle of the trees or the creak of the old cabin. It was deliberate, insistent. Knock, knock, knock. Jessica's grip on the baby tightened. "Daniel," she called out, her voice barely audible. No answer. The knocking came again, louder this time. Jessica's mind raced. Who or what could have followed them here? The lights? Agent Carter? Something worse? Her instincts screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. She rose slowly from the couch, her legs trembling as she backed away from the door. The baby stirred in her arms, letting out a soft whimper that sent a chill down her spine. "Daniel, if that's you, answer me," she shouted, her voice breaking. The door didn't open. Instead, the knocking stopped. Silence fell over the cabin, thick and oppressive. Jessica's pulse thundered in her ears as she stared at the door, willing it to stay closed. Then came the voice, a deep, guttural whisper that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Let us in." Jessica's blood ran cold. The words were faint, almost indistinct, but they were there, reverberating through the air like the hum that had plagued her since the baby's birth. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "What do you want?" The whisper came again, louder this time. "Let us in." Jessica took another step back, her back pressing against the far wall of the cabin. The baby let out a soft cry, its amber eyes glowing brighter in the dim light. The hum returned, faint at first but growing steadily louder, pulsing in time with the baby's cries. The door rattled on its hinges, as though something on the other side was testing its strength. Jessica's chest tightened with fear, and she clutched the baby tighter, her mind racing for a plan. Before she could act, the door burst open with a deafening crash, splinters of wood flying across the room. Jessica screamed, shielding the baby with her body as a blinding light flooded the cabin. It wasn't the warm glow of fireflies this time. It was cold, harsh, and alien, filling the space with an otherworldly energy. Jessica squinted against the light, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Shadows moved within the glow, indistinct shapes that seemed to shift and ripple like smoke. They stepped forward, their movements slow and deliberate, and the hum grew louder, vibrating through the cabin like an earthquake. "Stay back!" Jessica shouted, her voice trembling with fear and defiance. "Don't come any closer!" The shadows paused, their forms coalescing into vaguely humanoid shapes. One of them stepped forward, its outline flickering like static. It extended a hand toward her, and in that moment, Jessica felt an overwhelming surge of energy, like a tidal wave crashing over her. The baby's cries grew louder, rising to a pitch that made the air vibrate. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, and the glowing figure faltered, its shape flickering and distorting as though it were being pulled apart. Jessica didn't hesitate. She bolted for the back door, clutching the baby tightly as she ran. The cabin shook around her, the walls groaning under the strain of the energy filling the space. She reached the door and threw it open, stumbling into the night. "Jessica!" Daniel's voice rang out, and she turned to see him sprinting toward her from the van, his face pale with fear. "What's happening?" "No time," she shouted, grabbing his arm. "We need to go, now!" Together they ran into the dark woods, the baby's cries echoing in the night. Behind them, the cabin erupted in a blinding flash of light, the sound of the explosion deafening. Jessica didn't look back. She couldn't. Whatever had come for them, it wasn't finished, and she knew this was only the beginning of the nightmare. A week had passed, though it felt like an eternity. Jessica and Daniel had managed to find refuge in an abandoned farmhouse miles from the cabin's remains. The house was a shell of its former self, its paint peeling, windows broken, and furniture reduced to skeletal remains of wood and fabric. But it was quiet, and for the time being, it was safe. Except for one thing. The baby, no, the child, had changed, rapidly, unnaturally. Jessica sat on a tattered couch, staring at the small figure on the floor before her. A week ago, she had cradled a newborn in her arms, its tiny fingers grasping hers with fragile innocence. Now, a child who looked no younger than 6 years old sat cross-legged on the floor, its amber eyes fixed on a pile of rusted nails and broken glass it had found. The child's once smooth skin now bore faint, glowing veins, like rivers of molten gold flowing just beneath the surface. "Daniel," Jessica called softly, her voice tinged with disbelief and exhaustion. Now, Daniel appeared from the kitchen, where he'd been piecing together a meal from whatever canned goods they'd scavenged. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. "What is it?" he asked, wiping his hands on a threadbare towel. She pointed at the child. "Look at them. They're building something." Daniel followed her gaze and froze. The child had arranged the nails and shards of glass into a meticulous pattern, a spiraling design that seemed almost too precise to be random. The hum that had haunted them since the birth was absent now, but in its place was something more unnerving. Silence. Complete and total silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath. "They're learning," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Faster than they should be. Way faster." The child looked up at them, its glowing eyes locking onto Jessica's. For a moment, she swore she could hear its thoughts, not in words, but in feelings. A rush of curiosity, confusion, and something deeper, something ancient. "Are you hungry?" Jessica asked tentatively. The child tilted its head, as though processing the question. Then it nodded, its movements eerily deliberate. Jessica rose, her legs trembling as she made her way to the kitchen. She rummaged through their meager supplies, her hands shaking. The cans of beans and soup she had once fed to the baby now felt absurdly inadequate for the child before her. Daniel joined her, leaning against the counter. "We can't keep ignoring this, Jess," he said, his voice low. "Whatever's happening to them, it's not normal. We need to figure out what's going on." Jessica's hands stilled. "And who do we go to for that, Daniel? The government? The same people who tried to take them from us? Or the lights in the woods that nearly killed us?" She turned to him, her eyes filled with fear and anger. "There's no one we can trust." "We can't keep running blind either," he shot back. "The child is evolving, Jess. Every day they're changing more, learning faster than a human should. What happens if we can't handle them? What happens if we're the ones in danger?" Jessica flinched at his words, but deep down, she knew he was right. She turned back to the cans, opening one and pouring its contents into a chipped bowl. She carried it to the child, who had returned to its strange arrangement of nails and glass. "Here," she said softly, placing the bowl in front of it. "Eat." The child looked at her, then at the bowl, and for the first time it smiled. The sight was both beautiful and unnerving, the glow from its veins intensifying for a moment before it reached for the food. It ate slowly, methodically, as though savoring each bite. Jessica sank back onto the couch, her head in her hands. "What do we do, Daniel?" she whispered. "How do we keep them safe when we don't even know what they are?" Daniel sat beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back. "We'll figure it out," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We always do." But even as he spoke, a faint vibration began to fill the air, like the hum of distant machinery. Jessica froze, her blood running cold. She looked at the child who had stopped eating and was staring at the window with unblinking eyes. "They're here," the child said, its voice soft but clear. Jessica's heart stopped. The child had spoken for the first time. Its voice wasn't the high-pitched tone of a child, but something deeper, resonant, and layered, as though multiple voices spoke in unison. "Who's here?" Daniel asked, his voice rising in panic. The child pointed to the window. "Them." Before they could react, the farmhouse shook violently, the hum growing louder until it was almost deafening. The glass in the window shattered, and a blinding light filled the room. Jessica shielded her eyes, grabbing the child and pulling it close as Daniel scrambled to his feet. Through the light, shadowy figures began to take shape, their forms flickering and shifting like static on a broken screen. They stepped forward, their movements deliberate, and the hum became a pulse, a rhythmic vibration that seemed to sync with the child's glowing veins. "Stay behind me," Daniel shouted, grabbing a rusted crowbar from the floor. The child squirmed in Jessica's arms, its glowing eyes wide with both fear and defiance. "No," it said firmly, its voice reverberating through the room. "They won't stop. Not until I go with them." Jessica tightened her grip. "No, we're not letting them take you." The figures paused, as though considering her words. Then one of them raised a hand, and the light intensified, washing over the room with a heat that made the air shimmer. The child reached out, placing its glowing hand on Jessica's arm. "It's okay," it said, its voice softer now. "I'll protect you." Before Jessica could respond, the child's veins flared with a brilliant light, and the hum reached a deafening crescendo. The figures recoiled, their forms flickering violently, as if the child's energy was repelling them. Jessica screamed as the world around her dissolved into light and sound, and everything went black. When Jessica opened her eyes, the light was gone. The farmhouse was eerily silent, save for the faint sound of wind whistling through the shattered windows. She sat up slowly, her body aching as though she had been thrown against a wall. Daniel was sprawled on the floor nearby, groaning as he pushed himself up. "Daniel?" she called out, her voice hoarse. "Are you okay?" He nodded weakly, rubbing his head. "I think so." What happened?" Jessica's eyes darted around the room, searching for the child. Panic surged through her chest as she realized the spot where the child had been was empty. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding. "They're gone," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They took them." "No," a voice said, calm and steady. "I'm still here." Jessica and Daniel turned toward the center of the room. The child stood there, but it was different now. No longer resembling a human child, its form glowed with an ethereal light, its body translucent and shimmering like molten glass. The veins of gold pulsed gently, and its amber eyes radiated an otherworldly intelligence. "What are you?" Jessica asked, her voice trembling. "What's happening?" The child stepped closer, its movement slow and deliberate. "I am not what you think," it said, its voice layered with echoes, each one resonating like a bell. "I was born into your world, but I do not belong to it." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. "You're not human?" The child shook its head. "I am something far older, far more ancient. My kind existed long before your world took shape, traveling across the stars, seeking knowledge and balance. When my essence entered your world, it was because I was drawn to the potential within humanity, the capacity for love, creativity, and resilience." Daniel took a cautious step forward. "Why did you come here? Why to us?" The child's glowing eyes softened. "Because I needed a vessel, a connection to this realm. And when I found you, Jessica, I felt your love, your fierce determination to protect. You became my anchor, my way to understand this world." Jessica's knees gave out, and she sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. "You're my baby," she whispered. "No matter what you are, you're still my baby." The child knelt before her, its small, glowing hand reaching out to touch her cheek. "And you are my mother," it said gently. "In every way that matters, you gave me life and taught me what it means to love." "But those things, the lights, the people who were after you," Daniel interjected. "Why? What do they want?" "They are remnants of a world that once knew my kind," the child explained. "Some seek to destroy what they do not understand, while others desire the power they believe I hold. But they do not realize that my strength is not something that can be taken. It exists only through connection, through understanding." Jessica wiped her tears, her hands trembling. "What happens now? Are they going to come back for you?" The child's glowing form flickered, its light dimming slightly. "They will not stop searching, but I cannot stay. My presence here puts you in danger, and I will not allow harm to come to you." "No!" Jessica cried, clutching at the child. "You can't leave. You're my child. You belong with us." The child's expression was one of deep sorrow. "I will always be with you, Jessica," it said, its voice soft but resolute. My essence is tied to you, to the love you gave me. But I must return to where I came from. It is the only way to ensure your safety. Daniel knelt beside Jessica, his hand resting on her shoulder. There's no other way? He asked, his voice breaking. The child shook its head. If I remain, they will keep coming, and the harm they bring will not be limited to us. It will spread to others, to your world. Jessica sobbed, pulling the child into her arms. Despite its glowing, otherworldly form, it felt warm and solid, like the baby she had held only a week ago. I don't want to lose you, she whispered. You won't, the child said, its voice filled with love. I will always be a part of you. And one day, when the time is right, you will feel my presence again. The light around the child began to intensify, filling the room with a radiant glow. Jessica and Daniel shielded their eyes as the hum returned, soft and rhythmic, resonating in their chests. The child stepped back, its form dissolving into a brilliant cascade of light that swirled around them like a gentle breeze. I love you, the child's voice echoed, growing fainter. Thank you for everything. And then it was gone. Jessica collapsed into Daniel's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. The farmhouse was quiet once more, the hum replaced by the soft rustling of the wind. For a long time, neither of them spoke, their grief too heavy for words. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. Do you think we'll ever see them again? Jessica wiped her tears, her gaze fixed on the faint golden glow that lingered in the air. I don't know, she said softly, but I believe they're still with us. In some way, they always will be. Daniel nodded, pulling her close. We'll get through this, together. As they sat in the broken remains of the farmhouse, holding on to each other, a faint warmth filled the room, like the comforting embrace of someone they loved. And for the first time in days, Jessica felt a sense of peace. Her child was gone, but their bond remained unbroken, a connection that transcended worlds, time, and space. And in her heart, she knew that this was not the end of their story. The following weeks were a blur of quiet mourning and tentative healing. Jessica and Daniel remained at the farmhouse, reluctant to return to a world that would never understand what they had experienced. The days stretched on, filled with heavy silences punctuated by whispers of memories that lingered like shadows. Jessica often sat by the window, gazing out at the vast, empty fields that stretched toward the horizon. She still felt the faint echo of the child's presence, like a warm breeze brushing against her cheek or the soft hum of energy in the stillness of the night. It was both a comfort and a reminder of the loss she couldn't fully comprehend. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with hues of orange and pink, Jessica ventured outside. She wandered to the edge of the field, her bare feet sinking into the cool, damp earth. The air was still, and the world felt impossibly large and quiet. She looked up at the sky, her eyes searching the heavens for a sign, a spark, a flicker of the light that had taken her child away. The stars blinked back at her, indifferent and distant, and she felt the weight of the universe pressing down on her. Are you out there? She whispered, her voice trembling. Can you hear me? For a long moment, there was only silence. And then, a soft breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the faintest hint of a hum. It was so subtle that she almost thought she had imagined it, but it sent a shiver down her spine and filled her with a warmth she couldn't explain. Jessica closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. She placed a hand on her chest, where she felt the faintest pulse of energy, a gentle reminder that her child's essence still lived within her. They're with us, Daniel said from behind her, his voice quiet but certain. He stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. I feel it too. Jessica turned to him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I miss them, she said, her voice breaking. I do too, Daniel replied, pulling her into his arms. But they're not really gone, Jess. They're part of us now, always. As they stood together under the fading light of the evening sky, the hum grew fainter, until it was barely a whisper on the wind. But Jessica knew it would never truly disappear. It would always be there, a constant reminder of the love she had shared with her child, a love that had defied the boundaries of worlds. In time, Jessica and Daniel found their way back to a semblance of normalcy. They left the farmhouse and returned to their lives, forever changed but determined to move forward. They carried the memory of their child with them, not as a source of sorrow, but as a beacon of hope and resilience. And though they never saw the glowing lights or the shadowy figures again, they knew their child was out there, somewhere among the stars, watching over them. One night, years later, Jessica stood on the porch of their new home, gazing up at the sky. She saw a faint, flickering light in the distance, just for a moment, and smiled. "I love you," she whispered, her voice carried away on the night breeze. And for the first time, she felt whole.